Hi everybody! This lecture is about sounds in poetry. This lecture is going to be pretty heavy in vocabulary. So I'm going to begin by going over one set of terms, and then as I continue throughout the lecture, I'll be introducing new terms. So the first three terms I'm going to introduce are onomatopoeia, alliteration, and assonance. And all of these terms refer to sound or patterns of sound in poetry. The first term, onomatopoeia, is the use of a word that resembles the sound that it denotes. And some of the examples that I give you here are quack, which sounds like the noise quack. It sounds like the noise that a duck makes. The word buzz, which sort of sounds like, buzzing. And then also the word sizzle, which with those Z's sort of sounds like a sizzle. So these are all words that the way that they're pronounced and the sounds that they make when we say them sort of imitates or resembles the sound that it's denoting in the word. The second term that I have here is alliteration. And alliteration is the repetition of the same consonant sound, remembering that a consonant is any letter that's not a vowel. So a couple of examples I've given here are luscious lemons, in which you have the repetition of that L sound, and the word descending, or the phrase descending dewdrops, in which you have the repetition of that D sound. In both of these examples, the consonant is coming at the beginning of the word, but that doesn't have to happen. Alliteration can also happen when those sounds are within the words. So we see it most often probably at the beginning of words, but it also refers to the repetition of consonant sounds within words as well. And then the final term here is assonance, which is the repetition of the same vowel sound. So again, I give you a couple examples here. Asleep under a tree. So in that phrase, we have a repetition of that double E sound. And then also the phrase time and tide, where we have the repetition of that sort of hard I sound, so time and tide. So when we put these together, we can get various kinds of effects of sound. One of the kinds of effects we can get is euphony. And this euphony occurs when the lines in the poetry are pleasant to the ear. So when we hear them, it sounds almost sort of musical and is pleasant to look for, or pleasant to listen to. So an example of this that I'm going to give you is the first four lines of John Keats's poem, To Autumn. So I'll begin by just reading it out loud. And as I read it, I want you to listen to it. And first of all, listen for sort of patterns of sound that you might notice, the repetition of vowel sounds or the repetition of consonant sounds. But then also I want you to think about what the overall effect of that is as you listen to it. From To Autumn by John Keats. Season of mists and mellow fruitfulness, close bosomed friend of the maturing sun, conspiring with him how to load and bless with fruit the vines that round the thatch eaves run. So as you were listening to it, you may have picked up on some repetition of sounds. In the first line, we have repetitions of that S sound, and we have the repetition of the M sound, as well as some repetition of L sounds. So there's a lot of repetition that sort of holds that line together. In that second line, we have the repetition of the S sound again. And the third line, we have the repetition of the S sound, as well as the repetition of an H sound and an L sound. And then in the fourth line, we have the repetition of R sounds, of that V sound, and also of the N sound. And as you put those all together, what you get is four lines that are fairly pleasant to listen to and almost sound musical, or at least arguably sound musical. The opposite of euphony is cacophony, or cacophony. It's hard for me to say. So this occurs when lines of poetry are discordant and difficult to pronounce. So this is really sort of the opposite of that sort of musical, pleasant sound. And the example I have here comes from Jabberwocky, which has a nonsense poem by Lewis Carroll. 'Twas brillig and the slithy troves did gear and gimble in the wab, all mimsy were the borogoves and the mombe raz outgrabe. So, unlike the last poem that I read, which was sort of pleasant to listen to and easy to say and almost sounded musical, this poem is sort of difficult to pronounce, difficult to read out loud, and even though there's some repetitions of sound, they don't really sort of gel together. If you listen to them, it sort of sounds discordant. The next kind of sound pattern I want to talk about is rhyme. So you're probably reasonably familiar with rhyme. As you know, it's two or more words or phrases that repeat the same sounds. The most common kind of rhyme, which you're probably most familiar with, is end rhyme. And this is when there's rhyme at the end of poetic lines. And I give you this example here from lines 14 to 17 of Robert Southey's poem, The Cataract of Lodore. It runs through the reeds and always proceeds through meadow and gale, and through meadow and glade, in sun and in shade. So in these 4 lines, the first 2 rhyme. We have reeds and proceeds, and then the second 2 rhyme. We have glade and shade. In addition to end rhyme, we can also have internal rhyme, and that's when there are rhymed words within a line. So not just happening at the end of the lines, but also within the lines. And an example of this are lines 30 through 31 of the same poem. So in these lines, it says dividing and gliding and sliding and falling and brawling and spalling. So we have dividing, gliding, and sliding all rhyme within that line, and then falling and brawling and sprawling. And these are all words that rhyme within that line. So to sort of talk a little bit about how this works in practice, sort of identifying this, I'm going to go over a larger selection from To Autumn by John Keats. So as I read this aloud, I want you, as you follow along, to try to keep an eye out for the kinds of rhyme that you notice in this poem. I'll tell you right now that it's mostly going to be end rhyme, but there might be some internal rhyme happening as well. All right, from To Autumn by John Keats. Season of mists and mellow fruitfulness, close bosom friend of the maturing sun, conspiring with him how to load and bless with fruit the vines that round the thatch eaves run, to bend with apples the mossed cottage trees, and fill all fruit with ripeness to the core, to swell the gourd and plump the hazel shells with a sweet kernel, to set budding more and still more later flowers for the bees, until they think more days will never cease, for summer has overbrimmed their clammy cells. So I went ahead and sort of wrote out the rhyme scheme for you here. And notice that I use letters to signal rhymes. So the first word that I notice is fruitful, the first sort of end, the end of the line that I notice is fruitfulness, so I give that an A. And then the next one is sun, which doesn't rhyme with fruitfulness, so I give it a new letter, B. And then the third line, I notice that rhymes with the first line, A, so I write A next to that. And then the second line, the fourth line, I notice that rhymes with the second line, so I write B. And I sort of move through the poem doing this. And this sort of visually shows me which lines in the poem rhyme with other lines, at least in terms of the end rhyme. And what this does is allow me to sort of visually see what's happening with the rhyme. It also tells me and lets me see how Keats is, in some ways, returning to the same sounds throughout the poem. So he has he introduces 2 rhymes in the first 4 lines, so that A, B, faithfulness, bless, and then sun and run. But then in the second part of the stanza, he really sort of continues with the same pattern, the same sounds. So we have trees, core, shells, and then more, which rhymes with core, then bees and cease, which rhyme with trees, and then finally cells, which rhymes with shells. So all of these sort of hold the whole stanza together and provide it with this sort of sense of unity, not just through sort of the imagery, which has a lot to do with each other, but also through the repetition of sounds and the repetition of rhyme. I'll also point out to you one sort of internal partial rhyme, which is swells and shells. So this isn't an exact rhyme because swell doesn't have the S sound at the end of it. However, these sounds are similar, and sometimes people who study poetry will call this a partial rhyme or a slant rhyme, which means that they're close, but they're not exact. So as we are reading poetry this week, in addition to thinking about things like imagery and word choice and figures of speech and symbols, I also want you to be thinking about sound. What sounds do you notice? What patterns of sound do you notice? And then what's the overall effect of those patterns of sound? Do you get sort of euphony? Do you get sort of musical sounds? Do you get cacophony? However you say that word? Or is it sort of discordant and jarring? And then, if possible, taking the next step and thinking about what that might have to do with the sort of theme or the images or the argument of the poem. Do you notice any sort of similarities in the repetition of sounds and what the effect of that sound is, and also what the poem itself is talking about? And just to give you a heads up, so the specific poems that you'll be reading for this week are John Updike's poem, Play Your Piano, Emily Dickinson's poem, A Bird Came Down the Walk, Helen Chason's poem, The Word Plum, and then a sort of version of Scarborough Fair, which is a very old sort of English ballad, and then Maya Angelou's poem, Still I Rise. And then in addition to those, I'll also be asking you to listen to a couple performances. One is Simon and Garfunkel's very famous performance of a song, Scarborough Fair, that's based on that old English ballad, and then Maya Angelou's performance of her song, Still I Rise. So we'll be listening to these performances and thinking about how the performances sort of reinforce or maybe change the sound patterns that you notice within the poems. So I look forward to hearing what you have to say about all of these poems this week.